Dear listeners, prepare yourselves for an enthralling journey into the depths of mystery and psychological intrigue. You are about to experience a story unlike any other, a tale woven with suspense, fear, and the haunting whispers of the unknown. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss another chilling tale. Sit back, listen closely, and let the shadows of uncertainty draw you in. The Midnight Veil is a story shrouded in secrecy, a tale that plays on the thin line between reality and illusion. Inspired by the great mysteries of literature, this story delves into the darkness of the human mind, where reason and madness dance in eerie synchronization. Our protagonist, Eleanor Graves, arrives at Blackwood Manor, a house tainted by tragedy, where secrets whisper through the walls, and every shadow conceals a lurking truth. Unlike any conventional mystery, this tale is a descent into the unknown, where Eleanor must untangle the chilling puzzle surrounding her fiancé, Victor Alden, a man convinced that an unseen force is dragging him into the abyss of insanity. The villagers murmur of a curse, a shadowed past that grips every Alden heir before they meet a tragic fate. But is it truly a curse, or is something far more sinister at play? As Eleanor pieces together Victor's fragmented fears, the truth she unearths is far more terrifying than she ever imagined, because sometimes madness isn't born from within. It is carefully planted, cultivated, and set to bloom at the perfect moment. As the clock strikes midnight, and the veil between truth and deception thins, the question remains, will Eleanor escape the nightmare, or will she too succumb to the darkness that has claimed so many before her? Dear listeners, brace yourselves for a tale of dark secrets and psychological intrigue. Tonight we unravel a chilling mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you love thrilling stories filled with suspense and deception, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another gripping tale. Now let the mystery unfold. The Whispers of Black Hollow is a haunting mystery wrapped in layers of secrecy, where the line between reality and paranoia blurs with each passing moment. It begins with Evelyn Harrow, a woman desperate for answers, standing at the gates of Black Hollow Manor, a place burdened by tragedy, where whispers seem to echo through the empty hallways. She has come to seek the truth about Victor Langley, her fiancé, who has suddenly broken off their engagement. His reason? He believes he is losing his mind. At first, Evelyn dismisses his fears as mere anxiety, but as she begins to uncover the disturbing past of the Langley family, she realizes that madness may not just be a fear, it may be a curse. Victor's father vanished without a trace. His grandfather spent his final days screaming about shadows that moved on their own, and now Victor himself is plagued by terrifying visions, figures lurking in the corners of his room, whispers calling his name in the dead of night. Is he truly descending into madness, or is there something far more sinister manipulating his mind? Evelyn refuses to accept that the man she loves is doomed to insanity, and as she digs deeper, she discovers a terrifying secret hidden within the walls of Black Hollow, a secret that has claimed the sanity of every Langley heir before Victor, and now it has its sights set on him. But the question remains, will Evelyn save him before the darkness consumes them both, or is she already too late? Dear listeners, tonight we unravel a tale of shadows and secrets, a mystery so chilling it will keep you questioning the line between madness and truth. If you love gripping stories of psychological suspense, subscribe now and step into the unknown. Let the darkness speak. The Echoes of Ashford Manor is a tale wrapped in deception, fear, and an unspeakable past that refuses to stay buried. At its heart is Eleanor Whitmore, a woman desperate for answers after her fiancé, Lawrence Ashford, suddenly breaks off their engagement. His reasoning? He claims he is losing his mind. At first, Eleanor believes it to be nothing more than stress, until she hears the whispers, the hushed voices of the townspeople who speak of the Ashford curse, a legacy of madness and horror passed down through generations. Strange occurrences have plagued the estate for the past year, livestock slaughtered in the dead of night, eerie figures spotted near the cliffs, and servants who refuse to speak of the things they have seen. Most unsettling of all, Lawrence's father, Lord Ashford, once a man of great stature and command, now spends his days locked in his study, muttering to himself about a presence watching from the darkened corridors. But is it truly madness that grips the Ashford bloodline, or is something far more sinister at play? Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor begins piecing together the fragments of Lawrence's fears, only to find herself entangled in a mystery far deeper than she ever imagined. The past is not dead. It is waiting, watching and whispering in the silence. As the clock strikes midnight at Ashford Manor, the question remains, will Eleanor uncover the truth before she too is lost to the darkness, or has fate already sealed her doom? Dear listeners, prepare to step into the unknown, a world where reality and illusion intertwine, where the truth hides in the shadows, and where madness and mystery walk hand in hand. If you crave tales of deep psychological suspense, subscribe now so you never miss another chilling story. Now let the mystery begin. The Curse of Ravenswood Hall is a story of secrets buried deep within the walls of an ancient estate, where generations of tragedy whisper through its darkened corridors. At the heart of this enigma is Julian Blackwood, a man of striking strength, a towering figure with the air of an unbreakable warrior, yet beneath his powerful exterior lies a mind tormented by unseen horrors. His fiancée, Evelyn Sinclair, watches helplessly as the man she loves falls deeper into a silent dread, withdrawing from her, speaking of dreams filled with faceless figures and voices calling his name from the abyss. Julian's father, Lord Blackwood, once a man of unshakable authority, now appears a mere ghost of himself, aged beyond his years, his eyes hollow with fear. The Blackwood name has long been shrouded in whispers, rumors of madness that strike every generation, of heirs who meet tragic fates before their time. Some call it a curse, others believe it to be something far more sinister. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn enlists the help of renowned investigator Alistair Graves, a man known for peeling back the veils of deception. As he steps into Ravenswood Hall, he feels it immediately, an oppressive presence, an eerie silence that seems almost sentient. And then the disappearances begin. Servants vanish without a trace, strange symbols appear carved into the woodwork, and the air itself seems to pulse with an unseen force. Is Julian truly slipping into madness, or is he being manipulated by an entity far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined? As the pieces of the puzzle begin to form, Evelyn and Alistair realize that something ancient and malevolent has been waiting in the darkness, biding its time, and now it is ready to claim its next victim. As midnight looms over Ravenswood, one question remains: will Evelyn and Alistair unearth the truth before Julian is lost forever, or will the curse of the Blackwood bloodline consume them all? Dear listeners, prepare yourselves for a story unlike any other, a tale where reality unravels, fear takes form, and madness lurks just beyond the edge of reason. If you crave suspense that lingers in your thoughts long after the last word is spoken, subscribe now, and let the mystery unfold. The Shadows of Blackthorn Manor is a chilling enigma, wrapped in whispers and dread. The legend of Blackthorn Manor is one that haunts the countryside, a place where the past refuses to die, where secrets fester beneath polished oak floors, and where every ancestor met a fate worse than death. The last of the Blackthorn line, William Blackthorn, is a man of imposing presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that seem to pierce through the soul. But there is something else behind those eyes, something fractured, something afraid. For years Blackthorn Manor has stood untouched, a grand estate slowly decaying under the weight of its own dark past. The villagers speak in hushed tones of the family curse, a madness that awakens in the bloodline every few generations. William's father, before his untimely disappearance, spoke of a presence in the house, something that watched from the shadows, something that whispered his name in the dead of night. Now the whispers have begun again. The servants hear footsteps in empty halls, the hounds refuse to enter certain rooms, and William wakes with blood on his hands, and no memory of how it got there. His fiancée, Eleanor Carter, refuses to abandon him. She knows the man she loves is not mad, but she also knows that something is terribly, horribly wrong. Desperate, she turns to an investigator, unlike any other, Edmund Graves, a man known not only for solving the unsolvable, but for unearthing the truths that no one dares to face. As Graves steps into Blackthorn Manor, he senses it immediately, an unshakable, suffocating presence, a history of terror clinging to the very air. The deeper he digs, the more the truth eludes him. The Blackthorne family history is riddled with inconsistencies. The deaths of William's ancestors are too perfectly tragic, and the more he learns, the less sense it all makes. But one thing is certain, William Blackthorne is running out of time. As the nights grow longer, and the whispers grow louder, Graves and Eleanor must race to uncover the truth before William either loses his mind, or becomes the next victim of the Blackthorne curse. Because at Blackthorne Manor, madness is never just madness, it is something far worse, and it is waiting. The storm raged outside Blackwood Hall, wind howling through the ancient trees like the cries of restless souls. Inside, the air was thick with secrets. Eleanor Grayson sat in the dimly lit drawing room, her fingers tracing the rim of a delicate china teacup, though she had long since abandoned drinking from it. Across from her sat Detective Alistair Graves, a man of sharp intellect and colder demeanor. Between them lay a mystery that refused to be silenced. "It started with the animals," Eleanor whispered. "First the sheep in the lower pastures, throats slit in the dead of night, then the hounds, mutilated, left as if something had been feeding on them." She shuddered, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Then the dreams began. Graves leaned forward. "Whose dreams?" "My fiancé Jonathan. He wakes up screaming. He says there's someone in his room whispering to him. He swears he can feel their breath on his skin, but when I run in, he's alone." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And then there's the blood on his hands." Graves studied her. "Has Jonathan ever suffered from episodes before?" Eleanor hesitated. "His grandfather was institutionalized. So was his great-uncle. My father warned me, but Jonathan isn't mad." She inhaled sharply. "He isn't." The detective's eyes flickered toward the portrait above the fireplace. A woman with striking auburn hair, her hand resting lightly on a hound's collar. The plaque read Eleanor Blackwood, 1862. The resemblance to his host was uncanny. "The Blackwood curse," Graves murmured. "A madness that skips generations." Eleanor paled. "You don't believe that, do you?" "I believe," Graves said slowly, "that legends are born from truths people are too afraid to face." A crash echoed from upstairs. A guttural scream followed. Then silence. Eleanor bolted to her feet. "Jonathan." But Graves was faster, already reaching for the revolver beneath his coat. "Stay here." He took the stairs 2 at a time, his pulse steady despite the icy dread creeping up his spine. The hallway was dark, the only illumination coming from a flickering oil lamp at the end of the corridor. Jonathan's door was ajar. Graves pushed it open. The bed was empty, the sheets soaked with blood, the window shattered, and in the corner carved into the wood with inhuman precision was a message. "It is time." A chill ran through him. Jonathan Blackwood was gone, and the hunt had just begun. The old estate of Ravenswood stood against the howling wind, its towering structure barely illuminated by the flickering gas lamps that lined the cobbled driveway. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of unsaid words. Lady Evelyn Harrow sat motionless in the vast parlor, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while across from her, Detective Ambrose Vane observed her with quiet intensity. "You don't understand," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's happening again." Vane tilted his head slightly. "The incidents," she swallowed hard. "Not just the deaths, the visions, the whispers in the walls. My brother Lawrence, he swears he sees her." Her voice broke. "Our mother, Detective, but she's been dead for 20 years. Vane remained silent for a moment, studying the ornate fireplace where flames twisted like silent phantoms. The portraits above it, a long line of Harrow ancestors, seemed to watch him, their painted eyes holding centuries of secrets. "And your father?" he finally asked. Evelyn exhaled shakily. "He's a shadow of himself. Ever since Lawrence began speaking of the hauntings, father has deteriorated. He barely eats. It's as if something is draining the life out of him." Vane leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "And what do you believe, Lady Harrow?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I believe something in this house does not want us here." A sudden crash echoed from the upper floor. Both turned toward the sound, tension rippling through the air. Vane was the first to move, his footsteps swift and purposeful as he ascended the grand staircase. The corridor was cold, unnaturally so, and the heavy drapes billowed as though stirred by unseen hands. He reached Lawrence's door. It was ajar. He pushed it open. The bed was empty, sheets tangled as if their owner had fled in terror. The window was wide open, the night wind howling through it, and on the wall scratched deep into the wood were 3 words, "She is here." A breath of icy air ghosted down his spine. Evelyn appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Where is he?" Vane's fingers traced the carved letters. "Gone." A deep, distant bell tolled from the estate's clock tower. Midnight. Somewhere in the house, a whisper curled through the darkness, and they were no longer alone. The halls of Blackthorn Manor whispered with secrets, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the towering portraits of the family's ancestors. Inspector Alistair Graves stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the cold marble floor. Across from him, Lady Genevieve Sterling clutched her hands together, her knuckles pale as bone. "You don't believe me, do you?" she murmured, her voice tight with emotion. Graves studied her, his sharp eyes unreadable. "I believe something is terribly wrong in this house, my lady." Genevieve swallowed hard. "You think my brother is guilty?" A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the heavy drapes shudder like living things. The inspector sighed, glancing at the locked study door. "I think, Lady Sterling, that your brother fears he might be." Her breath hitched. "He would never, but he doesn't remember, does he?" Graves interrupted, his voice low. "He wakes with blood on his hands, with his clothes stained, with no recollection of where he's been, or what he's done." A rustle from the staircase made them both turn sharply. Lord Edward Sterling stood at the top of the grand stairs, his figure barely visible in the dim glow of the chandelier. His eyes haunted, shadowed, stared down at them. "It's happening again," he whispered. The inspector took a step forward. "Tell me everything." Edward exhaled, his fingers gripping the railing. "Last night, I woke up outside. My hands were covered in mud, my shoes dripping with something thick and dark. The hounds were howling, and then," his breath hitched, "I found the door to the west wing open, but I swear I locked it myself." Genevieve's hands trembled. "Edward, I saw something in the mirror," Edward continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not my reflection, something else, watching me." Silence fell thick and suffocating. Graves narrowed his eyes. "This isn't madness, Lord Sterling. This is something worse." A crash echoed from the west wing. A long inhuman wail followed. Graves turned swiftly. "Stay here." The inspector strode toward the darkness, the candlelight flickering behind him, and then the shadows swallowed him whole. The air inside the study was thick with the scent of aged wood and pipe smoke, a room steeped in years of contemplation, duty and silent suffering. Admiral Reginald Chandler lowered himself into the high-backed leather chair, the weight of his years pressing down upon him. Across from him, Hercule Poirot observed the man carefully, taking in the fine lines of exhaustion etched into his stern face, the quiet despair lurking beneath his otherwise formidable presence. "You wished to speak with me, Admiral?" Poirot asked, his voice even, unhurried. Chandler let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples, as though trying to stave off a deep and familiar headache. "I can't help but feel sorry that Diana brought you into this," he admitted gruffly. "The poor child is clinging to hope where there is none. But this is our private tragedy, Monsieur Poirot, and I trust you understand that we do not wish for outsiders meddling in it." Poirot leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "I understand that pain wishes to remain private, but when that pain begins to spill into the lives of others, when it begins to take a form that can no longer be ignored, is it not then that one must seek clarity?" Chandler's face darkened. He knew the truth in Poirot's words, yet to acknowledge them aloud was a different matter entirely. "Diana refuses to believe it," Chandler continued, as though speaking more to himself than to Poirot. "I couldn't believe it at first either, but now there is no denying what we are dealing with. It is in the blood, Poirot, the taint, the curse of the Chandlers. It comes for us, always." Poirot observed him keenly. "And yet you agreed to the engagement. If you suspected, if you feared, why permit your son to entangle another in his fate? The Admiral stiffened. Because I had no idea, he said firmly. Hugh takes after his mother. Nothing about him reminded me of the Chandlers. I hoped, prayed even, that he had inherited none of it. And why would I have thought otherwise? From childhood, he was perfectly normal. No signs, no erratic behavior, nothing. Until now. Poirot nodded, his mind swiftly assembling the puzzle pieces. Many old families have whispers of madness in their bloodlines, Admiral, he said softly, but not all seek to conceal it. You have not consulted a doctor. Chandler's face turned red with anger. No, he snapped, and I won't. The boy is safe here, under my care. I won't have him locked up, studied like some rabid animal between four walls. I will not allow them to take my son from me. Poirot's gaze did not waver. You say he is safe here, but are others safe? A flicker of something uncertainty, fear passed through Chandler's eyes. His lips pressed into a tight line. What do you mean by that? Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead he let the silence stretch, watching how the Admiral's fingers twitched, how his breathing became shallower. Finally, Chandler spoke again, but his voice was lower, weaker. Each man to his trade, Poirot. You are looking for a criminal. My boy is not a criminal, not yet. Poirot's brow arched slightly. Not yet.
Leopold, 2K.
You believe it will progress, Chandler exhaled sharply. These things don't just stop, Poirot. They grow, they fester. Those sheep, he paused, his jaw tightening. Who told you about the sheep? Diana Maberly, and also your trusted friend, Colonel Frobisher. Chandler's expression darkened. George would have done better to keep his mouth shut, he muttered, shaking his head. Poirot remained quiet for a moment, before tilting his head slightly. He is a very old friend of yours, is he not? My best friend, Chandler said gruffly, and he was a friend of your wife's as well. Something flickered in Chandler's eyes, a memory long buried, but never forgotten. His voice when he spoke again, was quieter, more reflective. Yes, George was in love with Caroline, I believe when she was very young. He never married. I suspect that was the reason. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You were the lucky one, were you not, Admiral? You won her heart. A bitter smile ghosted across Chandler's lips. So I thought. I carried her off, only to lose her. His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, he seemed impossibly weary, an old man but burdened by too many ghosts. Poirot allowed the weight of the moment to settle before speaking again, his voice gentle but firm. Colonel Frobisher was with you when your wife drowned, was he?
Bill.
Chandler nodded. Yes, he was with us down in Cornwall when it happened. Caroline and I were out in the boat together. He happened to stay at home that day. You said you never understood how the boat capsized. Poirot continued. You believe it simply sank. Chandler's brows furrowed. It must have sprung a sudden leak. The waters were calm. There was no reason for it to go down the way it did. His voice trailed off, as though he had repeated this explanation to himself too many times over the years, never quite convinced by his own words. Poirot tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. And yet, it did sink, and Caroline was lost. Chandler's eyes flickered with old pain. Yes. Poirot sat back in his chair, his sharp mind whirring. The Chandler's curse, the madness that ran in their blood, the incidents with Hugh, the lingering shadow of a tragedy long past, and yet something still did not fit. The way the Admiral spoke of his wife, of Frobisher, of Hugh, it all pointed to something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. A mystery not of madness, but of something far darker. Poirot glanced up at Chandler, his expression unreadable. Admiral, he said quietly, there is more to this than you realize, and I fear that if we do not uncover the truth soon, it will not be history that repeats itself. Chandler stared at him, his jaw tight. What are you saying? Poirot's eyes gleamed. I am saying, Admiral, that Hugh Chandler may not be the one you should fear. And at that moment, from somewhere in the house, there came a long blood-curdling scream. The bay had been calm that evening, but the tide was strong, too strong. Admiral Reginald Chandler's voice was steady at first, as he recounted the memory, but then it wavered, betraying the weight it had carried for so many years. I held her up as long as I could. he murmured, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as if he was still in that moment, still fighting against the cruel sea. Then the break, a silence stretched between him and Poirot, thick with old grief. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Her body was washed up 2 days later. Thank the Lord we hadn't taken little Hugh out with us. At least that's what I thought at the time. He exhaled heavily, shaking his head. Now, well, better for Hugh, poor devil. Perhaps if he had been with us, if it had all been finished then, if the Chandlers had ended that night. Poirot studied the Admiral carefully, noting the way his gaze seemed fixed on something distant, unreachable. There was no anger left in him, no fight, only the resignation of a man who had already decided that fate was inescapable. We are the last of the Chandlers, Monsieur Poirot. After we're gone, there will be no more Chandlers at Lisle. When Hugh got engaged to Diana, I hoped. He stopped himself, swallowing thickly. No good talking of that now. Thank God they didn't marry. That's all I can say. Poirot said nothing, allowing the moment to settle. He understood now. This was not just grief, not just sorrow, it was fear. Later Poirot found himself seated in the rose garden, the air thick with the scent of late summer blooms. Beside him sat Hugh Chandler, his broad shoulders hunched, his fingers twisting together in agitation. The young man's face, handsome yet haunted, turned towards Poirot with an expression of quiet desperation. You've got to make her understand, Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice rough with frustration. Diana is a fighter. She won't give in. She won't accept what she's damned well got to accept. His fists clenched against his thighs. She keeps believing I'm sane. Poirot observed him for a moment before speaking, his tone calm yet pointed. While you yourself are quite certain that you are, pardon me, insane. Hugh flinched as if struck. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I'm not completely mad, not yet, but it's getting worse. His voice was barely above a whisper now. Diana doesn't know. She's only seen me when I'm normal. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And when you are not. A long shuddering breath left Hugh's lips. He tilted his head back slightly, staring at the night sky, as though searching for something. Then I dream, he admitted finally, and when I dream, I am mad. Silence settled between them, heavier than before. Then slowly, methodically, Hugh spoke again. Last night, he said, his voice almost detached, I wasn't a man anymore, I was something else. First a bull, a maddened raging bull. I could feel the sun scorching my back, the dry dust choking my lungs. I was charging, running wildly through the heat, through a haze of red, my mouth full of dust and blood. His breath hitched, dust and blood. Poirot did not interrupt. He watched, waiting. Then I was a dog, Hugh continued, his fingers digging into the fabric of his trousers, a great slavering beast. I had hydrophobia. I could feel it. My throat burned, my body trembled with an unnatural thirst, but I couldn't drink. I saw them, children. They screamed, ran from me. I lunged, snapping, growling, wild with hunger. Men tried to shoot me. Someone put a great bowl of water in front of me, but I couldn't drink. His hands were trembling now. I wanted to, I needed to, but I couldn't swallow. I woke up gasping, my mouth parched, my throat so dry, I could barely breathe, and I knew it was true. I stumbled to the washstand, desperate for water, but when I tried to drink, he exhaled sharply. I couldn't. I physically couldn't swallow. My own body wouldn't let me. Poirot murmured something softly, but Hugh hardly seemed to hear him. His fingers dug into his knees, his face drawn tight with an expression of horror. His eyes, half-lidded, distant, stared into the darkness of the garden as though he saw something lurking just beyond the reach of the lantern light. And Poirot, watching him closely, could not help but wonder, was this madness, or was it something far, far worse? There are things that aren't dreams, things I see when I'm wide awake, Hugh Chandler said, his voice low and trembling. He turned his face away from Poirot, as though ashamed to admit the words that followed. Spectres, frightful shapes. They leer at me, mock me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. Sometimes I am able to fly. No, not in the way a man dreams of flight. It is real. I leave my bed. I soar through the night, the winds carrying me, and I, his voice caught, then dropped to a whisper, Fiends bear me company. Poirot made a small sound, gentle, thoughtful, almost like a sigh. It was enough to make Hugh snap back, his haunted eyes locking onto Poirot's. "Oh, there isn't any doubt," he said hoarsely. "It's in my blood. It's my family heritage. I can't escape it." His hands tightened into fists, his breath uneven. "Thank God I found out in time, before I married Diana. Suppose we'd had a child." His voice broke, and he swallowed hard before forcing himself to continue. "Suppose I'd handed this frightful thing down to him. Another generation cursed. I couldn't." His fingers gripped Poirot's arm suddenly, desperation seeping from every fiber of his being. "You have to make her understand. You must tell her. She has to forget me, to move on. She will in time." His voice turned pleading. "There's young Steve Graham. He's crazy about her, and he's a good man, steady. He'd keep her safe. She deserves that. She deserves happiness." Poirot watched him carefully, and yet, he murmured, "Mr. Graham is hard up, is he not?" Hugh gave a humorless smile. "So are Diana's family," he admitted. "But they won't be when I'm gone." Poirot's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Ah," he let the words settle before continuing. "And why will they be all right when you are gone?" The answer came with unsettling gentleness. "My mother's money," Hugh said simply. "She was an heiress, you know. It all came to me, and I've left it all to Diana." Poirot sat back, folding his hands in his lap. "A most generous act," he said softly. "But you may yet live to be quite an old man, Mr. Chandler." Hugh's expression changed in an instant. The gentle melancholy hardened into something sharp, something final. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened. "No, Monsieur Poirot," he said with quiet certainty. "I am not going to live to be an old man." Then all at once, the color drained from his face, his entire body stiffened, his breath hitched, his gaze lifted, past Poirot's shoulder, past the garden, beyond the rational world. His eyes widened, pupils blown as if staring into the abyss itself. His fingers convulsed on his knees, white-knuckled. "My God," he choked out. "Look." Poirot did not turn. He had spent too many years in the company of the lost and the haunted to fall into that trap. Instead he watched Hugh with keen, unwavering focus. "It's standing by you," Hugh whispered, his voice thin and reedy. "A skeleton. Its bones are shaking. It's calling to me, beckoning." His entire body jerked as though he had been physically pulled forward. Then as suddenly as it began, the spell broke. Hugh collapsed back against the bench, his chest heaving, sweat beading along his forehead. His hands clutched at his arms, as if to keep himself from shaking apart. After a long silence, he turned to Poirot, his voice stripped of all bravado, all pride. It was the voice of a child, lost and afraid. "You didn't see anything, did you?" Poirot slowly shook his head. Hugh let out a shaky, bitter laugh. "I don't mind seeing things so much," he murmured. "It's the blood I'm afraid of." He looked down at his hands as though expecting to find them stained crimson. "The blood in my room, the blood on my clothes." His voice dropped to something barely audible. "We had a parrot once," he said absently. "Bright, beautiful thing. It used to repeat everything I said. One day I woke up, and the cage was open. Feathers everywhere. Blood. It never spoke again." Poirot remained silent, and in the garden, the wind stirred, whispering through the roses like a ghost passing through the world of the living. "It was there in my room this morning," Hugh Chandler whispered, his voice barely more than a brace, its throat cut, his hands clenched, his knuckles whitening as he continued. "And I was lying on the bed, with the razor in my hand, wet with its blood." Poirot sat still, watching him with quiet intensity. Hugh leaned in, his breath uneven. "Even just lately, things have been killed," he whispered, "all around, in the village, out on the downs. Lambs, a collie dog." His throat worked as he swallowed. "Father locks me in at night, but sometimes the door is open in the morning, and his voice faltered. "I must have a key somewhere, I must, but I don't know where I've hidden it." His gaze turned haunted, unfocused. "I don't know." A shudder racked his body, and his fingers pressed against his temples, as if trying to keep something inside, something clawing to escape. "It isn't me who does these things," he said, almost pleading now. "It's someone else, someone who takes possession of me, who turns me from a man into a raving monster, someone who wants blood." A silence fell, heavy, hands suffocating. Then in a barely audible voice, he added, "And who can't drink water?" Suddenly he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shook, though whether from rage or despair, Poirot could not tell. After a long pause, Poirot asked quietly, "I still do not understand why you have not seen a doctor." Hugh Chandler lifted his head, his face drawn and pale, then he gave a bitter laugh. "Don't you really understand?" His voice was raw, edged with something dangerously close to hysteria. "Physically, I'm strong. I'm as strong as a bull. I could live for years, years." His fingers tightened against his knees. "Years, shut up between four walls." His face twisted. "That I can't face." He let out a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost calm. "Almost. It would be better to go out altogether," he said. "There are ways, you know, an accident, cleaning a gun, that sort of thing." His eyes darkened. "Diana will understand." His jaw tightened. "I'd rather take my own way out." Poirot did not speak at first. He simply watched, observed. Then instead of addressing Hugh's challenge, he asked, his voice mild, "What do you eat and drink?" Hugh blinked, thrown off course. Then abruptly, he let out a bark of laughter, short, sharp, bitter. "Nightmares after indigestion, is that your idea?" Poirot only repeated, "What do you eat and drink?" Hugh's laughter faded. "Just what everyone else eats and drinks," he muttered, his gaze narrowing slightly. "No special medicine?" Poirot asked. "Cachettes? Pills?" "Good Lord, no," Hugh said. "Do you really think patent pills would cure my trouble?" His mouth curled in a mirthless smile. "Canst thou then minister to a mind diseased?" he quoted, his voice mocking. Poirot remained unfazed. "I am trying," he said dryly. A flicker of something, doubt, curiosity, crossed Hugh's features. Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Does anyone in this house suffer from eye trouble?" Hugh stared at him, startled by the unexpected question. "Father," he said slowly, his eyes give him a good deal of trouble. He has to see an oculist fairly often. "Ah." Poirot's gaze darkened, though his expression remained unreadable. There was another silence, taut with unspoken thoughts. Then casually, too casually, Poirot murmured, "Colonel Frobisher, I suppose, has spent much of his life in India." "Yes," Hugh said, frowning slightly. "He was in the Indian Army. He's very keen on India. Talks about it a lot, native traditions and all that." Poirot exhaled softly, as if filing away the information. Then he murmured again, just loud enough for Hugh to hear, and something in that quiet sound sent a shiver through the room. "I see you've cut your chin," Poirot remarked, his eyes resting lightly on Hugh's face. Hugh put his hand up absently, fingers brushing over the sharp, raw gash just below his jawline. A smear of dried blood flaked under his touch. "Yes, quite a nasty one," he admitted. His voice was strained, detached. "Father startled me one day when I was shaving. I'm a bit nervy these days, you know." His hand fell away. "And there's been a rash lately, over my chin, my neck. Makes shaving a damn nightmare." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You should use a soothing cream." "Oh, I do." Hugh let out a sudden humorless laugh. "Uncle George gave me one." His lips curled in a wry smile. "We're talking like women in a beauty parlor now. Lotions, soothing creams, patent pills, eye trouble. What does it all amount to?" His gaze sharpened suddenly. "What are you getting at, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's voice was calm, measured. "I am trying to do the best I can for Diana Mertley." At the mention of the name, Hugh's entire demeanor shifted. The sarcasm drained from his expression, leaving something raw and deeply wounded behind. He reached forward, gripping Poirot's arm, his fingers trembling slightly. "Yes," he said. "Do what you can for her." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Tell her she's got to forget. Tell her there's no hope." His eyes darkened with something close to despair. "Tell her some of the things I've told you. No, tell her everything." His breath came faster, his grip tightening. "And for God's sake, tell her to keep away from me." He swallowed hard. "That's the only thing she can do for me now. Keep away, and try to forget." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Poirot watched him, his sharp eyes flickering with something unreadable. Later in the rose garden, Diana Mertley stood rigid, her face pale, her breath unsteady. "Have you courage, mademoiselle?" Poirot's voice was low, grave. "Great courage. You will need it." Diana's lips trembled. "Then it's true," she whispered. "It's true." He is mad. Poirot's expression did not change. I am not an alienist, mademoiselle, he said softly. It is not for me to say this man is mad. This man is sane. Diana's hands balled into fists at her sides. But everyone else says it. Admiral Chandler, Uncle George, even Hugh himself. She broke off suddenly. Poirot's gaze held hers. And you, mademoiselle? He asked. What do you say? Her throat worked, but her voice was firm. I say he isn't mad. Poirot tilted his head. That, he murmured, is very interesting. Diana took a step forward, her eyes burning. That's why I came to you, she insisted. There couldn't have been any other reason, could there? Poirot studied her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, that, mademoiselle, is exactly what I have been asking myself. A shadow flickered across her face. I don't understand you, she said. Poirot's voice was mild. Who is Stephen Graham? Diana froze. The color drained from her cheeks. Stephen Graham, she repeated. Her breath hitched. Oh, he's just someone. Poirot took a slow step forward. She caught his arm suddenly, her fingers gripping his sleeve, desperate now. What's in your mind? She demanded. What are you thinking? Poirot did not answer. He only blinked at her, his expression unreadable beneath the crisp curve of his mustache. You stand there, she said, her voice rising, blinking in the sunlight, not telling me anything. Her breath shuddered. You're making me afraid. Poirot did not move. And in the silence that followed, the fear in her eyes deepened. Diana's breath came fast and uneven. She took an unsteady step back, her hands clenching at her sides. You're making me horribly afraid, she whispered. Perhaps, said Poirot slowly, because I am afraid myself. Her deep grey eyes widened, searching his face, desperate for answers. What are you afraid of? Poirot let out a sigh, long and heavy. His gaze flickered toward the great house, looming in the fading light. Mademoiselle, he said gravely, it is much easier to catch a murderer than it is to prevent a murder. A sharp intake of breath. Diana recoiled as if struck. Murder? She gasped. Don't use that word. Nevertheless, Poirot interrupted. I do use it. His tone was calm, unyielding. She shook her head, trembling. But who? What? Poirot cut her off. There is no time for explanations. There is no time to waste. You and I must pass the night at Liddell Manor. His voice, usually so measured, was quick now, urgent. I look to you to arrange it. Diana hesitated. Yes, I suppose I could, but why? Because, Poirot said simply, it must be done, and because you have courage, mademoiselle. He held her gaze. Prove it now. Do what I ask, without question. She swallowed hard, nodded. Then without another word she turned and strode toward the house. Poirot followed her inside. He heard her voice in the library, speaking to the men, their responses low, questioning, reluctant. He paid them no heed. Instead, he moved swiftly, his footsteps silent on the grand staircase. The upper floor was deserted. He found Hugh Chandler's room with ease, a large airy space, a heavy oak wardrobe, a writing desk with papers scattered untidily, a four-poster bed draped in shadow. In the corner, a wash basin with gleaming silver taps. Above it, a glass shelf, lined with bottles, tubes, jars. Poirot did not hesitate. He worked quickly, efficiently. His fingers moved with practiced precision, examining, testing, confirming. His expression did not change, but his eyes, his sharp, knowing eyes, reflected something cold and calculating. Minutes later, he descended the stairs, his manner as composed as ever. Diana was waiting in the hall. Her face was flushed, her eyes stormy. It's done, she said shortly. Poirot inclined his head. As they spoke, Admiral Chandler appeared from the library, his face set in a grim frown. Mr. Poirot, he said, his voice tight. A word, if you please. Poirot followed him inside. The library was dimly lit, the scent of old books and pipe smoke thick in the air. Admiral Chandler turned to face him, shutting the door behind them. His voice was low, strained. Look here, Monsieur Poirot, I don't like this. Poirot tilted his head. What is it that you do not like, Admiral? Diana, Chandler said gruffly. She's insisting that you and she both stay here tonight. His expression darkened. I don't want to be inhospitable, but it is not a question of hospitality. Poirot interrupted gently. Chandler exhaled sharply. his frustration evident. "Frankly, I don't like it, I don't want it, and I don't understand the reason for it. What good can it possibly do?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Shall we say, Admiral, that it is an experiment?" Chandler stiffened. "What kind of experiment?" Poirot smiled faintly. "That," he murmured, "is my business." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "Now listen here, Poirot. I didn't ask you to come here in the first place." Poirot raised a hand. "Believe me, Admiral Chandler," he said softly, "I quite understand your position." His eyes darkened. "But I am here for one reason, and one reason only." The fire crackled in the hearth. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen. Chandler's fingers clenched around the edge of his desk. "And what," he asked slowly, "is that reason?" Poirot met his gaze. A silence stretched between them. Then Poirot said, his voice very quiet, very sure, "To prevent a murder." Admiral Chandler's brows knitted together, his expression carved from stone. "You don't understand, Poirot. There's nothing to see. Every night I lock Hugh in his room. That's the—" Poirot's mustache twitched slightly. "And yet," he murmured, "your son tells me that sometimes the door is open in the morning." Chandler's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. His jaw tightened. "That's nonsense. I always assumed George had unlocked it." "Had you?" Poirot's gaze was piercing. "And where do you leave the key, mon ami?" Chandler exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "On the chest outside his door. Either I, George, or Withers the valet, take it in the morning." His voice was gruff, defensive. "Withers knows why, of course. We told him Hugh walks in his sleep. He's been with me for years. He's loyal." Poirot tilted his head. "Is there another key?" "Not that I know of," Chandler muttered. A shadow passed over his face. Unless one was made, but who would do such a thing?" Poirot's voice was calm, unshaken. "Your son believes he has one, hidden, somewhere." He paused. "Although in his waking state, he does not remember where." A heavy silence fell. From the far end of the room, Colonel Frobisher shifted uncomfortably. His voice was low, edged with unease. "I don't like it," he muttered. "The girl." Chandler turned sharply. "Exactly what I was thinking." His voice was tight, urgent. "She mustn't come back tonight. If you must stay, Poirot, fine, but Diana must not." Poirot's expression did not change. "Why do you not want Mademoiselle Mabry here tonight?" Frobisher's fingers twitched. "It's too risky," he said simply. "In cases like this." He trailed off. Chandler exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Hugh is devoted to her," he said roughly, "and that's exactly why she shouldn't be here." His voice dropped. "Everything's topsy-turvy when a madman's involved. Even Hugh knows that." Poirot studied them both for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "That decision, messieurs, is not yours to make. Mademoiselle Diana will decide for herself." He turned on his heel and left the library. Outside, Diana was waiting in the car, fingers drumming impatiently on the wheel. The moment she saw him, she called out, "Did we win?" Poirot slid into the seat beside her. "We return to collect what we need for the night. We shall be back in time for dinner." She laughed, tossing her hair over one shoulder. "Do they really think Hugh would hurt me?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he studied her carefully, then said, "Would you mind stopping at the chemist's in the village, mademoiselle?" She shot him a curious glance. "Why?" Poirot smoothed his gloves. "There is something I have forgotten." His voice was mild, but his eyes, his sharp, knowing eyes, betrayed something else, something urgent, something deadly. The chemist's shop stood in the quiet heart of the village, its small glass windows glowing faintly against the night. Diana drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at the door. Poirot had been inside for far too long. She frowned. Surely it didn't take this long to buy a toothbrush. Her unease grew. The village, so peaceful during the day, seemed unnervingly still at this hour. Even the wind had died, leaving only the hush of trees and the distant lap of water against the riverbank. A creeping sense of foreboding crawled up her spine. Then the shop door swung open. Poirot stepped out, his face unreadable, his hands tucked neatly into his coat pockets. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said lightly, settling into the passenger seat. "Let us return." "Yes, there is much to be done." Diana pulled away from the curb, but something in his tone made her grip the wheel tighter. The house loomed dark and silent as Poirot sat waiting in his room. The grand Elizabethan furniture cast hulking shadows against the walls, the ornate carvings seeming to twist and contort in the dim light. The air was thick with silence, stretching into the long hours of the night. Poirot did not sleep. He sat, patient, unmoving. Then, a noise, soft at first, a shuffle, a whisper of movement against the wooden floor. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked toward the door. Another sound, a slow, deliberate scrape. Then silence. Poirot exhaled slowly. He did not rise. He did not move. He simply waited. Minutes passed. Then, a sudden commotion, a cry, heavy footsteps pounding down the corridor, a door thrown open. The summons had come. Poirot moved swiftly, unbolting his door. Outside in the dimly lit hallway, two figures stood. The Admiral's face was grim, his lips pressed into a hard line. Beside him, Colonel Frobisher trembled slightly, his hands twitching as if resisting the urge to grab something, anything, for stability. Chandler's voice was tight. "Will you come with us, Miss Poirot?" Poirot followed them without a word. At the end of the hallway, just outside Diana's bedroom door, a figure lay motionless on the floor. The breath in the corridor seemed to still. The light from the wall sconces cast a cruel glow over the scene. A man's body, collapsed in a heap, a heavy dressing gown tangled around his legs. His chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. In his right hand, limp against the floor, was a knife, a gleaming, wickedly curved blade, and it was not entirely clean. Dark patches, glistening red, marred the surface. Poirot inhaled sharply. "My boy." Admiral Chandler's voice was thick with anguish. "My poor boy." From inside the room, Diana's voice rang out, sharp with fear. "Who is it?" Frobisher stepped forward, rapping on the door. "Diane, it's us. Open up." There was a rustle of movement. A second later the door creaked open. Diana stood there, her face bloodless, her hands trembling at her sides. "I heard something," she whispered. Someone at the door, the handle rattling, scratching on the wood. She shuddered violently. It was awful, like an animal. Frobisher exhaled sharply. "Thank God your door was locked." Her eyes darted to Poirot. "You told me to lock it," she said. Poirot's expression did not change. "Yes," he murmured, "and it is fortunate that you did." Behind them the two men bent to lift the unconscious figure from the ground. As they carried him inside, Diana gasped, stepping back. Her voice broke. "Hugh." Her eyes swept over him, his slack features, his breath shuddering, the knife still clutched in his hand. Then she saw his hands, sticky, wet, a dark reddish-brown stain smeared across his fingers, trailing down his wrist. Diana's breath caught. "Is that—" She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that blood?" Poirot did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on Hugh Chandler's pale face, and in his sharp, knowing eyes, there was no surprise, only certainty, and something far, far darker. Poirot's sharp gaze swept over the room. His eyes met the Admiral's, searching. The older man hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Not human," he said gruffly. "Thank God, a cat. I found it downstairs in the hall." Throat slit, his voice hardened. "Afterward, he must have come up here." A chill settled over the room. Diana shuddered, her voice barely above a whisper, carried a note of horror. To me, the words hung in the air. On the chair Hugh Chandler stirred, a low mutter escaped his lips. The onlookers tensed. Slowly, painfully, he sat up. His movements were sluggish, as though he were swimming up from the depths of a nightmare. His eyes blinked, unfocused. "Hello." His voice was thick, dazed. "What's happened? Why am I—" The words died in his throat. His gaze had fallen on the knife still clenched in his hand. For a long, terrible moment, he simply stared at it. Then, in a slow, strangled voice, he asked, "What have I done?" No one answered. His eyes darted around the room, searching each face. They landed at last on Diana. She stood rigid, pressed back against the wall, her face bloodless, her breath shallow. His fingers tightened around the blade. "Did I?" He swallowed. "Did I attack Diana?" The Admiral shook his head. Hugh exhaled, something inside him loosening, but only for a moment. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me what happened." No one wanted to speak. The words were dragged out reluctantly, haltingly, piece by piece, and Hugh listened. Outside the window, the first tendrils of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon in streaks of soft pink and gold. Poirot moved to the window, drawing back the heavy curtain. The room filled with morning light. Hugh's face was unreadable. He stood slowly, stretching his arms. Then, to their shock, he smiled. "Well," he said, his voice eerily casual. "Beautiful morning. Think I'll head out, maybe try to catch a rabbit." He turned and strode from the room. For a moment no one moved. Then the Admiral lunged forward. "No," Frobisher's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "Charles, no." His voice was hoarse, strained. "It's the best way for him. Poor devil. If for nobody else." Diana let out a broken sob and collapsed onto the bed. The Admiral closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. His voice, when it came, was uneven. "You're right, George," he exhaled shakily. "You're right, I know." Frobisher swallowed hard. His voice too was unsteady. "The boy's got guts." A heavy silence settled. Then the Admiral's head snapped up. "Damn it," he muttered. "Where's that cursed foreigner?" In the gun room, Hugh Chandler moved with a quiet, deliberate precision. The gun felt familiar in his hands. Its weight, its balance. One shell, two. The soft click of metal sliding into place. He took a breath, raised the barrel. A hand fell on his shoulder. "Poirot." The detective's voice, when it came, was quiet, steady. One word, "No." Hugh froze. Slowly he turned his head, eyes burning with something raw, something desperate. "Take your hands off me," he said thickly. His breath was ragged, his fingers tightening on the weapon. "Don't interfere. There's going to be an accident. That's the only way out." Poirot did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply repeated, with absolute, unshakable authority, "No." And this time, it was not just a command. It was a verdict. "No. Don't you realize?" Hugh's voice was raw, desperate, as he turned on Poirot. "If that door hadn't been locked, I would have." His throat tightened. "I would have cut Diana's throat." Diana's. His voice broke on her name. His fingers clenched into fists. "With that knife." Poirot remained unmoved. His voice was calm, certain. "I realize nothing of the kind." Hugh's breath caught. He stared at the detective, as though seeing him for the first time. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Poirot said steadily, "that you would not have killed Miss Mabbury." Hugh let out a ragged laugh, harsh, bitter. "I killed the cat, didn't I?" "No." Poirot's voice was firm, unwavering. "You did not kill the cat." Silence. Poirot took a step closer. His dark eyes bore into Hugh's. "You did not kill the parrot. You did not kill the sheep." Hugh swayed where he stood. His breath was shallow. He shook his head, as though trying to clear the fog of a nightmare. "Are you mad?" His voice was hoarse. "Or am I?" Poirot's expression did not change. "Neither of us is mad." A heavy silence filled the room. Then the door opened. Admiral Chandler and Colonel Frobisher entered, their faces lined with exhaustion and unspoken fears. Diana was just behind them, her hands clasped tightly together. Hugh's head jerked up. His voice was weak, dazed. "This chap says I'm not mad." Poirot turned to face the others. "I am happy to tell you," he said, "that Hugh Chandler is entirely and completely sane." A stunned silence. Then Hugh laughed, a hollow, humorless laugh, the kind that echoes in the corridors of an asylum. "That's damned funny," he said. His voice was shaking, but his eyes were dark with something deeper than fear. "Sane, am I? It's sane, is it? To cut the throats of sheep and other animals, to wake up with blood on my hands, to hold a knife in my sleep." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I was sane when I killed that parrot. When I slit that cat's throat tonight." Poirot shook his head. "You did not kill the sheep," he said softly, "or the parrot, or the cat." Hugh's breath caught. He took a half step back. "Then who?" Poirot's voice did not waver. "Someone who has had from the very beginning only one goal." He let the words sink in. "To prove you insane." A sharp intake of breath from Diana. Hugh swayed. "What?" Poirot's voice was unrelenting now, each word cutting through the fog of fear like a blade. "Each time you were drugged, a heavy soporific. Each time a blood-stained knife or razor was planted near you. Each time someone else's bloody hands were washed in your basin. A stunned silence. Hugh stared at him, his lips slightly parted. But why? Poirot did not hesitate. To drive you to this exact moment, to make you believe that the only way out was to end your own life. Hugh's face drained of color, his fingers twitched at his sides. Poirot turned to Frobisher. "Colonel, you have lived many years in India. Did you never encounter cases where a man was deliberately driven mad by the administration of drugs?" A flicker of recognition passed over the colonel's face. He nodded slowly. "Never came across one myself, but I've heard of them. Datura poisoning. Slowly, steadily, it erodes the mind. It ends by driving a man completely insane." Poirot nodded. "Exactly." His voice was sharp now, quick with certainty. "The active principle of datura is very closely related to atropine, an alkaloid derived from deadly nightshade, and atropine sulfate. It is commonly prescribed in eye treatments. A duplicate prescription, made up in different places, could provide a large enough quantity of the poison without ever raising suspicion." Another silence. Poirot turned back to Hugh. His voice softened. "You were never mad, mon ami. You were made to believe you were." Hugh stood very still. His hands trembled at his sides. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Then who?" Diana's breath caught. The Admiral's fingers curled into fists. Poirot's gaze flickered, sharp as a knife. "Yes," he murmured. "That is the final question, is it not?" Poirot's voice remained calm, unwavering, as he continued. "The alkaloid could be extracted easily, and then introduced into, say, a simple, everyday item, one that no one would ever suspect." His eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "A soothing shaving cream." Hugh blinked. "Shaving cream." His voice was hoarse, almost disbelieving. Poirot nodded. "Applied externally, it would cause a mild rash, nothing alarming at first. But soon as irritation built, it would lead to tiny abrasions when you shaved, and thus with each stroke of the blade, the drug would enter your bloodstream, little by little, day after day." A deep silence fell over the room. "The symptoms would begin gradually," Poirot continued. "First dryness of the mouth and throat, a slight difficulty in swallowing, but then, hallucinations, double vision, sudden moments of confusion." His gaze locked onto Hugh's. "All the symptoms that you have experienced." A shudder went through Hugh. His breath hitched. He ran a trembling hand over his jaw, as though trying to feel for the poison that had seeped into his very skin. Poirot took a step closer, his voice softer but no less firm. "And to remove the last doubt from your mind, mon ami, I will tell you this." A pause. A flicker of triumph in his sharp eyes. "It is not merely a theory, it is a fact." Hugh stiffened. "I took a sample of your shaving cream," Poirot said, "and had it tested." A deathly hush. The words landed like a hammer blow. "Your shaving cream," Poirot said, "was heavily impregnated with atropine sulfate." Diana let out a tiny gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. The Admiral swayed on his feet. Colonel Frobisher inhaled sharply. Hugh, pale as death, whispered, "Who?" His throat was tight, constricted, as if the poison still held him in its grip. "Who did this?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead he turned away, as if gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, locking them into place with unerring precision. "That," he murmured, "is what I have been studying since the moment I arrived here." His fingers tapped lightly on the back of a chair, his eyes distant. "I needed to find the true motive behind all this. Murder, mon ami, is rarely without motive. I looked for the obvious one, first financial gain." His gaze flicked to Diana for the briefest moment. "Miss Mabbury would have benefited from your death, but I did not consider her a serious suspect." Hugh's head snapped up. A fierce glint flashed in his eyes. "I should hope not." Poirot continued, unruffled. "Then I considered another possibility, a motive as old as time itself." Silence thickened like fog. "The eternal triangle." Poirot's voice was quiet, but it held weight. "Two men, one woman." Diana stiffened. Hugh's hands curled into fists. Poirot's gaze shifted, cold, calculating. "Colonel Frobisher had once been in love with your mother." His words were soft, but each one landed like a dagger. "And yet, it was Admiral Chandler who married her." A strangled sound escaped the Admiral's lips. His hands shook. "No, no, George, I won't believe it." But Hugh stood frozen, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Hatred," he said, "does not always die with time. Sometimes it festers, and sometimes it is not the man himself who is made to suffer, but the son." A terrible silence. "Then, that's a damn lie." Colonel Frobisher's voice exploded like a gunshot. His face was livid, his eyes burning with fury. "Don't believe him, Charles. Don't you see what he's doing?" The Admiral took a step back. His face, once strong and unshakable, was etched with something dangerously close to fear. Hugh swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "Is it true?" Frobisher's hands clenched. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. "You're mad. You're all mad." His voice cracked, high with something close to desperation. Poirot merely watched, silent, waiting. And then, in that thick, suffocating quiet, the truth settled over them like a death sentence. Poirot's voice, sharp as a dagger's edge, cut through the heavy silence. "Datura, India. Yes, I see it now. The perfect crime hidden in plain sight." He turned suddenly, his gaze burning with realization. "And we would never suspect poison, not when madness already runs in the family." The room seemed to shrink around them. Hugh's breath was unsteady, his fingers twitching as if reaching for a truth that had eluded him for too long. Poirot's voice rose, charged with urgency, a madman bent on revenge, cunning, as only madmen can be, concealing his true nature for years, waiting, watching, until the moment was right to strike. He whirled on Frobisher, his eyes blazing. "You must have known. You must have suspected. Hugh was your son. Why did you never tell him?" Frobisher staggered back, his face ashen, his mouth opened, but for a moment no words came. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, broken. I didn't know. I couldn't be sure." He swallowed hard, his throat working as if the words themselves were choking him. "Caroline. She came to me once. She was frightened, desperate. I could see it in her eyes, but she never told me why, never explained what haunted her." His breath shuddered. "And then, we lost our heads. Just once, just that one night. But we both knew, we had to play the game. There could be no scandal, no questions." He let out a shaky breath. "I wondered, of course I wondered, but Caroline never said anything." And then when the madness appeared, when Hugh started showing signs, he broke off, shaking his head. "It settled things for me. I convinced myself I was wrong." Poirot's voice was like a whip. "Yes, it settled things. You looked away. But Charles Chandler, he did not." A deathly stillness filled the room. Poirot took a slow, deliberate step forward, his words falling like stones in deep water. "You did not see it, Colonel, but Charles Chandler did. He saw the way the boy thrust out his face, the way his brows furrowed, just so, a trick he inherited not from him, but from you." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Charles Chandler knew the truth. He learned it from his wife. Hugh's breath came sharp and fast, his knuckles turned white. Poirot went on. "I believe she was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do, because you see, Admiral Chandler had already begun to show her the madness in him. That was what drove her into your arms, Colonel. She had always loved you." A tremor passed through Frobisher's body. His lips parted, but he said nothing. Poirot's words sharpened like a blade. Charles Chandler planned his revenge carefully. His wife's death, it was no accident. He and she were alone in that boat, and he knows exactly how that accident came about. Diana let out a tiny strangled cry. The room was suffocating with the weight of the revelation. Poirot's gaze darkened, but his hatred did not die with her. No, it festered. He turned it upon the boy who bore his name, but who was not his son. And then an idea took root in his mind, a slow, methodical destruction. "Madness runs in the family, does it not?" Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. Or at least, that is what he wanted the world to believe. A shiver ran through Hugh. "The stories you told him, Colonel of India, of the datura plant, of the poison that drives men mad, they planted the seed." Poirot's voice was quiet, but relentless. He saw his way forward. Hugh would not simply die. No, that would be too simple, too kind. His words dripped with chilling certainty. Hugh Chandler would be driven mad, driven to despair, and in the end, he would take his own life. A long, terrible silence. Then a sound, a choked, hollow laugh. Hugh exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. His voice was little more than a whisper. Sane. I am sane. He turned to Diana, his hands trembling at his sides. Frobisher's voice was rough, but firm. You're sane enough, boy. There's no taint in our family. His words held an odd, quiet finality. Diana took a small step forward, her lips parted, her eyes shining. Hugh. But before she could speak, before anyone could move, Admiral Chandler stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for Hugh's gun. His voice was calm. Too calm. All a lot of nonsense. He lifted the weapon with steady hands, looking out toward the window. The morning light had begun to stretch across the land. The woods loomed in the distance. Think I'll go and see if I can get a rabbit. Frobisher started forward, but Poirot's hand clamped down on his arm. Poirot's voice was low, unshakable. You said it yourself, mon ami. It is the best way. Hugh and Diana stood motionless, watching as the last of the Chandlers stepped outside, his back straight, his pace unhurried. Across the park, he walked into the woods. A long stretching silence, then a single gunshot.